to you. Like I said just a moment ago, if you have any questions during the presentation, please feel free to put them in the Q&A and we will get to those later. With that, Amy, thank you so much for being with us tonight, and I'm going to turn it to you.
Well, good evening, everybody. Thanks, Annie, for inviting me. And I hope, since most of you are probably around the Grand Junction area, that you have seen Pinyon jays as you've been hiking around. And hopefully you'll learn some new information about them tonight as we give this presentation. It's going to be focused mainly on breeding Pinyon jay areas in Colorado. And let's see if I can get my slides to go. There we go. Okay, so for those of you who aren't super familiar with Pinyon jays, we'll have a little discussion about what they actually look like. They have a very sharp pointed bill, as you can see in this photo. It's very sharp and strong. They're entirely blue, but they have a little white underneath their chin. The immature birds will be a much duller blue or gray, but that's hard to tell that difference unless birds are next to each other. The adults are really bright blue and the immatures will be a little bit grayer, so you can tell the difference. They do have shorter tails as compared to other jay species, and this is because they do a lot of foraging on the ground. A little bit about their life history. They are a member of the corvid family, so they are in the same family as other jay species and ravens and magpies. They're highly intelligent and clever birds, and if you have seen any Pinyon jays as you've been walking around the woodlands, you can know that they are very vocal and have some complex communication. I know a lot of people will record them with their communication and then ask me what they're saying. And I wish I knew exactly what they were saying all the time, but they do have a lot of complex communication. They spend their entire lifetime in flocks, so seeing a single jay is pretty much a rarity, though you can see it every once in a while, but it's a highly social species. Their life expectancy is about 5 to 6 years, so relatively long life for a passerine. They have huge home ranges, and they can wander outside of these home ranges to find food when resources get scarce, and we'll cover this a little bit more as we go on. So this is the range of the Pinyon jay, the map to the left. They basically, in Colorado, occur in pinyon juniper woodlands, and these woodlands occur at elevations from around 4,900 to 8,000 feet. In this map, you can see the pink is more of the pinyon pine forest, and the lighter pink is juniper. You can see on this map that they do extend past pinyon pine in other states and in other areas, but the core of their range is in pinyon juniper woodlands. This forested landscape in Colorado covers about 21% of our state. They like to occupy pinyon junior woodlands that really transition to grassland and shrublands at lower elevations. And again, we'll talk a little bit more about this, which we have found in our research. They are uniquely adapted to a mutualistic relationship with pinyon pines. They've developed some morphological adaptations. One, they have an expandable esophagus, so they can collect a bunch of pine nuts all at once. They can actually carry about 56 pine nuts in their expandable esophagus. And if you compare this to a scrub jay, kind of the sympatric species with them, they can only hold 3 to 5. Again, they have this large pointed bill, and this is very useful for opening pinyon pine cones. And then in this photo, you can see the nair. I don't know if I can point, if you can see my pointer right here. This is featherless, and this is where it gets its genus Gymnorinus, meaning naked nostril. Most birds in this family have feathers around their nostril, and this is mainly because when they're poking around these green cones, there's a lot of sap, and so you don't want that sap to collect around, that nasal area, so they don't have those feathers. The pinyon pine tree on the other side has adaptations to provide pinyon jays with food. One, they have these large wingless seeds that require dispersal. If you've ever been under a tree that has just produced a bunch of nuts and they don't get dispersed, all those nuts just fall below the tree. So they really need other animals to disperse these seeds to other locations. These seeds are highly nutritious, so most animals are really wanting to take these for good nutrition and good food resources. These cones open upwards so that these nuts are easily accessible, as you can see in this upper photo. The one thing, though, is that these cones take a long time to mature. It takes 3 years to mature, and if during that maturity process conditions aren't good for them to ripen, you can find these cones with just desiccated seeds in them. So this is kind of produces a very unpredictable food resource. And it's thought that these trees really only produce a mass crop, what you're seeing in this lower photo, only about every 7 to 10 years. So this is hard for jays because they're having to deal with this really unpredictable resource. So they've also, in addition to having that morphological adaptation of being able to carry a lot of seeds, they can take these seeds and disperse them long distances. And then what they do is they cache them for later use. And a single jay has been measured to cache as much as 20,000 seeds in a single season. So that's a lot of seeds. And you can see in this upper photo, this is a seed that this pinyon jay has just actually watched it dig it up and flip it up and put it in its bill and fly away. So it's actually retrieving a cache here. These cache sites are usually at lower elevations, so there's not a lot of snow to cover them, so they can access them during the winter months and early spring. And they like to cache them in open areas such as grasslands, burned areas, and sagebrush parks. Again, if you can see, these are all jays in here, and they're actually caching. And if you ever find a cache site with a bunch of jays on the ground, then the vocalizations get really, really noisy, and you get a lot of variety at these sites of vocalizations. So another thing with their behavioral adaptation is, in addition to being able to carry these seeds long distances and hold a lot in their esophagus, they've been found to have incredible spatial memory. And this has all been tested in experimental way in lab conditions. And what they've been found is that they can find 95% of those seeds that they cached. And this is important for our woodlands because the remaining seeds are able to germinate and grow into new trees, as you can see in this photo with some young pinyon. These birds are one of our earliest nesting birds. They start nesting in mid-February, so think about how cold it is right now. These birds are going to start nesting in less than a month, so they're kind of crazy early breeders. They are monogamous. They do continue to be in the flock in the area that they're breeding, and that flock consists of adults and young helping birds. And again, in this photo is an area that we're starting to see some breeding behaviors, and this bird is carrying some nesting material. It's probably just doing some courtship behavior at this point in time where they'll pick up some material so that the other birds will follow them. They do breed in colonies, and what happens is starting about mid-February to the end of February, you'll walk into a pinyon jay colony and you'll start seeing all kinds of breeding behaviors, all kinds of vocalizations, and you'll just become overwhelmed. You won't even know what's happening in that area. And that's probably helping to swamp predators on detecting where nest trees potentially could end up. They have high site fidelity to these colonies, so they come back year after year after year to breed in these areas. Again, the flock in this area is made up of adult breeding pairs as well as the yearling helpers. These nesting colonies are much smaller areas that are embedded in their overall huge home range that we talked about before. Because they're breeding so early, these nests are insulated against the cold. So if you ever get lucky enough to see a pinyon jay nest, it's very thick and insulated. They like to line it with juniper bark where there's good number of junipers in the system. They lay they lay about 2 to 5 eggs, and this is kind of dependent on food availability, but most commonly you'll find a nest with 4 eggs in it. If food resources are limited, jays may forego nesting in that season. The female, as you can see on this top photo, this is a female in the nest. She incubates eggs for about 17 to 18 days. The males can sometimes be found silently guarding over the females, mainly when she's laying eggs. Once she's incubating, he's busy gathering food so that he can feed her near the nest because she's the only one that incubates. Females do brood nestlings for about 8 to 10 days, meaning the eggs hatch, the babies are in the nest, and the females sit on the nest to keep those nestlings warm, especially those early nesters. And then once those chicks are able to maintain their temperatures on their own, then she'll go off and help the male collect food to feed the nestlings. Nestlings fledge. The nestlings will fledge about at 22 to 24 days. This is actually a photo I captured of these two birds, these two young fledglings, just leaving the colony area. They don't stay in the colony area very long after they fledge because they are very noisy. The young helper birds will help guard them, and they just are a raucous group of birds. If you ever run into them, it's an overwhelming thing to see a big group of fledgling and yearling birds. So why did CPW start working on pinyon jays? A lot of people think they're very common because it's a jay, it's a bird that they can easily recognize and hear. But we've learned over the past 50 years using breeding bird survey data, which is just this kind of big effort. It's a citizen science effort in a lot of respects. We go out and do bird counts when they're breeding. And with this effort, we've seen this steep decline, as you can see in this graph. And so we don't know why this decline is happening. It is ranked as a species of greatest conservation concern in our state wildlife action plan that is going to come out again in 2025, a new version of that plan. And it has also been petitioned for listing and is currently under 12-month status review for consideration under the Endangered Species Act. So there is concern about how populations are doing range-wide. If you are an eBirder, which I don't know if there's many in this crowd, a lot of times you'll look at eBird data, and this actually shows an upward trend with pinyon jay populations. And I think that this one for pinyon jays in particular is that there's just been a huge interest in this bird, and there's a lot more people out birding. There's a lot of citizen science programs going on right now, started by GBBO, Great Basin Bird Observatory, which are trying to get volunteers out there looking for jays and report it on eBird. So I think this increase might not be what's happening, but maybe just more interest in pinyon jays. So as an agency, we knew that maybe some additional monitoring efforts for this jay were needed to better assess how populations were doing. So where do these conservation concerns stem from? Well, we do a lot of woodland management out there in the pinyon juniper woodlands. A lot of this is for other species, sage grouse. They like the sagebrush. They're not too keen on when those trees start to encroach in the pinyon juniper woodlands. We also do this for big game to promote big game habitats. We're doing it for fuels reduction to avoid these big catastrophic fires that we're seeing. And we know that the health of our pinyon juniper woodlands is a little bit in some areas not as healthy as it should be. So we're working to restore these ecosystems as well. And we are very new and we have very limited understanding on how to restore those. So we're trying to learn best how to do this woodland management. We also are dealing with climate change, as we're all aware, and long-term droughts can cause die-offs for both juniper and pinyon trees. We do have beetles with insect outbreaks that are causing die-offs of pinyon trees. And with the hotter weather and lack of moisture, we get a loss of those mass crops. Like I described before, when resources aren't good for that tree, a lot of times they'll abort those seeds and those aren't available anymore to pinyon jays to use for food resources. We're also looking at potential nest predators. Ravens seem to be a problem for pinyon jay eggs and nestlings, which I'll go over a little bit later. So for CPW, we've started 3 different projects starting in 2019. We were like, we don't know what jays are doing out on the landscape. We know we see them. We had no idea where one breeding colony was in the state. So we started just a kind of a early effort just to see if we could follow jays and find these nesting colonies. Once we started to find some nesting colonies, we wanted to see what was happening at these colonies. So we were going to assess nesting and fledging success. And now we've developed some good idea of how jays are using the landscape for nests. We want to start doing that kind of long-term monitoring and better assessment of populations and where this breeding is occurring. So I'm going to go through all these kind of projects that we've done and why we're focusing on the breeding season. Well, pinyon jays, like I told you, have a huge home range, and in fall, that's when those pinyon pine cones ripen. So in fall, that's when the jays are traveling really far distances, trying to find these masting crops, collecting those seeds, and taking them back to cache. So some of the flocks will join forces, and you can get really these large flocks flying around in fall, and they just roam widely. So it's really hard to assess a population that way. Once they've collected all the seeds that they can, winter comes and the flocks start to break up again, and they start just kind of traveling around looking for other food resources. In spring, though, that's when they come together to breed. They come to these nesting colonies. They spend 40 to 50% of the day at that colony area, and the flock is pretty stable. So it's the best time to really assess the numbers of birds and how good their reproductive output is. And that's why we're focusing on the breeding season. Again, in summer, you get a lot of little flocks going on. They're moving all over as fledglings are growing up, and the young and adults are moving around in different groups. So again, that's a hard time to assess pinyon jays. So our first surveys, we use these 10 by 10 kilometer plots, which are huge, and they're huge to survey. But we were able to find pinyon jays, and we were able to document breeding colonies. So this map shows these huge 10 by 10 kilometer grids that we used, and the red areas are where we actually found pinyon jays breeding. The yellows where we found pinyon jays but couldn't document any breeding. So you can see there's a lot of these yellow squares where we just didn't find any breeding, but we found jays. And the black squares are where we just didn't detect any pinyon jays. And during these surveys, because these grids were so large, we did all our surveys from a road with point counts. And so this is a road, and these red dots are point counts where we did a 6-minute point count to see if we could hear jays. And then once we found jays, we would immediately follow them to see if we could document breeding behaviors. And when we first started this project, I thought, oh my heck, we're never going to be able to follow jays. They fly like crazy. But it was amazing with some patience and just some stealth that you can follow those jays and you can recognize some breeding behaviors. So yeah, after several hours of walking and waiting and observing jays, hours, I mean, sometimes days, you can finally find an active nest and know where a pinyon jay is breeding. And sometimes it can surprise you, and you'll find them right on the road, the black circles around the nest tree, and this is the nest that we found in that tree. From this early surveys, we did learn that it takes time to learn how to interpret pinyon jay behavior. And so it took us a lot of hours to follow jays and to find these colonies. And a lot of times we got skunked, as you could see by those plots where we found jays and never found breeding. We also learned that pinyon jays are extremely vigilant, and they do have these sentinels watching out for you. So you do have to be really sneaky and quiet when you're watching pinyon jays and want to find their colonies. But we did realize that they have these pattern behaviors and even these flight patterns to help you decipher where a colony is. We also found that for management potentially of these colonies and conservation of them is a lot of these breeding habitat coincides with where elk and deer winter range is. And so for CPW, sometimes we close off these areas to protect, winter areas for big game, but we may be inadvertently protecting pinyon jay colonies as well since they're breeding so early, which was a positive finding for us. We did realize that if we continue this work, access into a lot of these areas where they're breeding is very difficult. It's snowy, it's wet, it's muddy, and so logistics can get really problematic. But once you start doing pinyon jay surveys, they are so addicting, and I can't go out in the woods without looking for a nest, looking for a pinyon jay. I just love working with them now. So where were we finding pinyon jay colonies? This is a graphic that's used by a lot of people who do woodland management. And so where we're finding pinyon jays is not in the really thick pinyon juniper woodlands. It's in the area that I described as on the edge of where sagebrush grasslands are. So you have this thicker part kind of going into this phase 3 where they put their nest. But like we talked about earlier, they have those short tails. So they like to come out here and forage on the grounds in these open areas. And that's where they put their cache sites. And also, I didn't mention earlier is that when they have young nestlings, they're really dependent on good protein, which means they like to have a lot of insects. And so those insects are more numerous out in the grasslands and sagebrush habitats or shrublands. So these are some of the pictures of some of the colonies we found, which kind of surprised us because we were thinking it was going to be in that thicker pinyon juniper woodland. So this is just kind of a shot from a hillside looking at a colony, and you can see it can be pretty open. It's right there at the edge where you'd run into some urban interface where the trees are coming down into some grasslands. This is where we're finding the actual colonies. So in this photo, the colony is where the blue circle is, or kind of where the opening is, and we didn't expect or did not find colonies in that thicker forest up above. And this all is important when we're considering how we need to treat woodlands and protect pinyon jay nesting. So this is a hillside where I pointed to one tour one time, and I pointed, this is Smith Mountain, so you guys might know Smith Mountain with your organization. But I pointed to this area and I said, oh, pinyon jays won't nest at the top of this hillside. Well, the next year they did nest up here, but what I found is where these arrows are, it's this thick forest, but there's all these openings. So we had a number of nests that came down here. And then when you walked around the forest, there was a bunch of openings where the soil wasn't appropriate for trees to grow. So never say never when you're working with wildlife. So that was kind of the start of our efforts with pinyon jays, and we learned how to follow them. We learned how to find breeding areas. So we wanted to do some more intensive surveys and look at their nesting, these actual colonies, and how well their reproductive output was occurring, and how many pairs were actually breeding in these colony areas. So what we did is we looked at 23 colonies. They're stretched across the area that we surveyed. So this is Moffett and Rio Blanco County up near Meeker. Here's Rifle. Here's Glade Park for you that are familiar with that. Here's Delta, down towards Montrose area, all the way out here into Disappointment Valley and here in San Luis Valley. And the blue dots are areas where we found active breeding in 2020 and 2021. And the yellow squares are where we didn't find active breeding areas with our intensive surveys. And so the questions for this project is we actually wanted to look at hatching and fledgling success to evaluate the threats to reproductive output. So we always think of pinyon jays, the threat to them is habitat. Maybe there's something else that's impacting them when they're nesting. We wanted to address that question of colony site fidelity. Is it really true for Colorado? Because we had never mapped colonies. And if it is true for Colorado, then these areas are going to be very important to conserve, protect, and manage to improve our population numbers. And this also gave us an opportunity to look at, could this program develop into a long-term monitoring program? So that would help us understand how the habitat condition and recruitment was occurring in the population and give us a better idea of what may be impacting our birds in this state. So I think this picture is really fun for everybody to see because we talked about how they can have a bunch of seeds that they can carry. This female came off her nest to get fed by this male. And as you can see, she got a big mouthful of pinyon nuts from him so she could go back on her nest. And so the females will, when they're incubating, and we talk about come off and beg, and the male will feed her. This is a female coming off her nest to beg. And this is a really helpful cue for us to find nests because we can actually watch her. She gets fed and then she flies right back to her nest and we can go, boom, there's a nest tree. So what we do is early in the season surveys is we go out, we found a good observation point in all those 23 colonies, and we just waited and watched the jays to look at their courtship behavior, so we could start, documenting, okay, this pair is going to be in this area, this pair is going to be in this area. Once they start nest building, you can watch them carry sticks back and forth, back and forth, back and forth to a tree, so you can actually pinpoint a nest tree. And then you can also wait for these feeding bouts so that you can watch where the female goes back to the tree. So the nice thing about watching jays is you can find a lot of nest trees if you're patient, and then you don't really have to disturb the birds. You don't have to go in the colony. But we were looking at the nests and visiting them every 4 days, and we would have to go in and peek to see if they'd hatched, fledged, or if that nest had failed. We also found that nests persist on the landscape, and so we were also mapping older nests so that we can map how big are these colonies, and if there's a bunch of old nests in this area, then we can also say, hey, this colony's been here for a long time, so they have high site fidelity to these areas. So this is me looking for nests. Sometimes these are old nests that I'm looking for now, not the new nests. The birds help you find the new nests. But when you want to find the old nest, it's like a needle in the haystack, and you kind of have to walk from tree to tree. And we always did this when birds weren't in the area or we didn't have any behaviors going on. And so this is what we would find, and we would classify the nest so we know how long they had persisted on the was, really freshly built. Maybe even it was used that year. We just didn't find it being active with a female or eggs or nestlings in the nest. But you can see how fresh these are. The cup is deep. The sticks look fresh. You can see the juniper lining. Class 2 nests or older, probably, 4, 5, 6 years now that I've been watching nests from when I found them until now. And it's just like the inner part of the nest is bubbling out, a lot of debris, but the shape is still there, and the twigs still kind of hold in that bubbly part of the nest. I mean, that inner lining of the nest. And class 3 nests are just really dilapidated. You can tell they had a pinyon jay in them because of the shape and because it had some juniper bark, but it really has just been on the landscape probably greater than 7 years. And then a class 4 nest is a lot of times pinyon jays will just start to build a nest kind of as a courtship thing, just throw some sticks together, never quite comes to a cup, but you know that pinyon jays were using this area for their colony site, was a class 4 nest. So some of our results are that for those 2 years, we were able to map 281 active nests, meaning we found eggs in a nest, female incubating or nestlings. But the other interesting thing is we were able to document over 1,400 old nests. So we were able to kind of map that colony and decipher site fidelity. We did find that nest tree height varied from 5 to 32 feet in height. So that's the height of the tree they were nesting in, but the average was 13 feet. Nest height varied anywhere from 2 feet off the ground all the way up to 23 feet off the ground. But again, it averaged at about 6 to 7 feet in height. Most of the nest tree species that we found them using for nesting were in juniper trees, both Rocky Mountain, Utah, and that was for this project. And we also found about 25% in pinyon pine. And I think the preference for juniper trees is they just have a little better twig density so that the nests are harder to find. So these are just some examples of the trees that we found nests in. It's hard to say a pinyon jay uses a certain kind of tree because they use all ages and height classes like we talked about. So they used these small trees for nesting, just really short, young trees. This was the common, like I said, about 13 feet, about 6-foot nest height. This was the most common type of tree that they would use. The circles are where the nests are in those trees. But then they use these really mature trees as well. So, again, it's hard to pinpoint them, but they like a variety. Using all these nests, we could determine that they had high site fidelity. This is a colony boundary right here. The purple squares are where we found active nests in 2021. The little circles, hopefully you can see this, is where we had active nests in 2020. And the triangles are where we found all our old nests. So you can kind of see they use the same area year after year to place their colony in. And these colonies, compared to where other information collected on jays, are much larger when you start incorporating following the Pinyon jays year after year and then looking at their old nests. We're talking anywhere from 631 hectares using both these old and active nests. So a pretty good size area that we need to consider. We did find that hatching success was pretty high for Pinyon jays, over 64% was pretty good, but fledging success went way down to about 23%. I think hatching success was much higher because the female really doesn't get off the egg. She stays there, the males feed her, she goes right back. But during that nesting time, they both get off, and those nestings are probably more susceptible to predation. And we did find that raven predation accounted for 83% of nest loss. So we are seeing a huge impact by ravens with this reproductive output. And this actually is a raven that I found on a power line pole, and this is, if you can see it, a little nestling that he has taken from the nest. And the ravens do, I've watched from a ridge, they actively hunt the colonies. They come in and flap at trees and try and get a response, and then they just kind of go in there, pick the nestling out, and fly off. And even I've watched the Pinyon jays, come in and mob the raven, and it doesn't seem to deter them at all. So they definitely are a nest predator for Pinyon jays. I did record other predation, great horned owls. I saw take a couple of these older fledglings. I usually count for that when the head is no longer on the body. Some other corvid predation like magpies or other jays that poke holes in the eggs, and then some small mammal predation where you just get the eggs all crunched up in the nest. But this was very minimal compared to the raven predation. So our conclusions were that, habitat condition out on the landscape, woodland condition may not be the only threat to Pinyon jays, but raven predation may be a cause of concern. As we've talked about, where they're nesting is at these lower elevations, and a lot of these colonies intersect with the urban interface where you're finding higher raven numbers. So something to think about when we're trying to manage these areas. Also, if Pinyon jay populations are declining, the number of pairs within colonies may be being reduced, so there's fewer and fewer Pinyon jays in a colony. And so when you have this much vocalization going on and this many breeding behaviors, you're kind of like showing what's happening. I can figure it out, then ravens can probably figure it out too. So back in the day when the colonies were much larger, there were many more birds, they could swamp the ravens, maybe potentially better, then maybe it worked better to have these really obvious behaviors that are now potentially being detrimental to the jays. Something to think about when we're managing them. We did find that jays have high site fidelity, so these are areas that we need to protect, conserve, and manage. And so what we've been actively doing is sharing our nest locations and our colony locations with land managers so that they can avoid where the jays are nesting, or even implement treatments that may be beneficial to jays, like maybe just removing some emergent trees so that creates some better insect abundance, better foraging areas. And so this map right here, the red is our colony polygon where we've drawn a polygon around our nests that we have found. The red dots are our nests. This is a habitat treatment that was being implemented. And so they drew their polygon not to treat where the Pinyon jay nests were. So we protected them by knowing where they were. And then we came up with some good treatment here, just some hand thinning of some Pinyon juniper trees. And then they could go ahead and do the rest of the treatment as planned away from the breeding area. So I think it's been really important to map and identify these areas for protection because, like I said, prior to 2019, we didn't know where any of these are, and these treatments are happening on the landscape. Finally, we are moving forward with more surveys for Pinyon jays. We've changed that huge 10 by 10 kilometer grid to a 2.5 to 2.45 kilometer grid where we can actually hike across and do point counts. If these grids are occupied, then we can follow the Pinyon Jays and do our breeding surveys that we've developed. We're continuing to map old and active nests. And as we find these colonies, we can continue to share this information with land managers so they know where these colonies are on the landscape. And this is our efforts, just these grids across the landscape. The colored ones are the ones that we surveyed because they're randomly sampled. We did this in 23 and 24. I'm hoping to do another survey in 2026 to keep building this information and build this project into a long-term monitoring program for jays so we can see how well they're doing across time. So far, our preliminary results from those surveys, as we were able to survey 198 grids, many more than we could with those 10 by 10 kilometer grids, makes it a lot nicer for sample size. We have been able to locate an additional 59 new colony areas, which is super exciting. Again, we were able to map 224 active nests and over 1,800 old nests, so really mapping these extent of these colonies. Again, we've been sharing this information with our land managers. I've also been working with a graduate student, Emily Macklin. She did all this work in the Royal Gorge field office, and so added a lot of information to our database. Half of those new colonies are ones that she found, as long as with the active and old nests. So this just gives you kind of an idea of where our colonies areas are. And I put McInnes Canyon up here and Dominguez Escalante here and the Gunnison Gorge. So you can see there are active breeding colonies in all three of these areas. So again, important to consider and manage, and you can kind of see even around Montrose, we're finding a lot of breeding colonies across the state, and we just hope to continue to find more. We have found some interesting observation across our works. Pinyon jays really like Mormon crickets. This is kind of what the Mormon cricket outbreak, these are all Mormon crickets on these trees, look like in the northwest part of the state in 2024, and pinyon jays just went on a feeding frenzy to eat these, so they were really beneficial. We did find that pinyon jays like burned areas, not surprising. That's, a lot of forbs and grasses coming up, so there's a lot of insects. So we actually saw them doing some fly catching behavior to catch insects. And on a negative note, there's a disease called keratin disorder that we've documented in a number of bird species. It just creates abnormal growth in the bill of a bird. And we did observe 2 jays with this abnormal growth. And if you ever do run into a pinyon jay and see this, it would be great if you reported it to me, or there is a website that you can report it to as well. And just thanks for all this hard work, everything we've learned about pinyon jays. I'm hooked. I'm so excited to be working on this project. And, anybody who sees pinyon jays, has questions, let me know. If you think you found a colony, let me know. Love to hear about it. And yeah, thanks for your time. And just, these are all the people that have helped over the years. Biologic, Sean Connor, Jim Lefevre, and Anna Petrie started those early surveys and really got the groundwork developed for finding colonies. And then all my wonderful survey technicians that helped me over the years. And just a lot of help with GIS and statistics with folks from CPW. And I guess with that, I can take questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Amy.
Sure.
I love the imagery of all that patience and stealth required to sneak up on these colonies.
Yeah.
So we do have some questions coming in already. For anyone else who has a burning question, please put that into the Q&A. To start out with, a couple questions just about some of that reproductive behavior and kind of their life history. So within that breeding behavior, so of their 5 to 7 year life, how many of those years are they reproducing? And do they mate for one season, or do they stay together for multiple seasons?
So for those 5 to 7 years, the yearlings don't always breed at 1 year old. And after that, they'll start breeding as long as resources are sufficient. Like I said, they can forego breeding. And they actually can breed any month of the year. If there's a really great cone crop, they can actually breed any month of the year. And then they are monogamous throughout their lifetimes. So that has been measured in some research in Flagstaff, Arizona, but they're in pairs during the breeding season, and then they kind of break off and become part of the flock during the non-breeding season, and then they can come back as the same pair the next year. Does that answer that question? I think I forgot
Yeah.
the second half.
Yeah, that was great. um, okay, next question. Is keratin disease contagious?
They don't really know what the cause of that is. Some of it, people said it was from bird feeders, but that doesn't seem to be the case. So they're not really sure what is causing that. There definitely needs to be some more research, but yeah, but there's been a number of different bird species that have shown this. And
Yeah,
I just had never heard of it in Colorado until we saw it last year. But I have heard of it, I guess when I brought it up, a couple of other states have seen it as well in their birds.
yeah. And you said there was a website for reporting that.
Yeah,
We
and I should
could,
have put it down. I think it's a USGS. If you just put up keratin disorder disease in birds, you'll find it.
yeah, I can
Yeah.
include that in my email that I send out to folks tomorrow with some of the follow-ups from this, including this recording that's going to go on YouTube and any other resources that you'd like to share.
Okay. Yeah.
Um, yeah. We have lots of questions coming on in. So I guess just to elaborate on that keratin disease, someone's asking, what did it look like? You showed that image of the elongated beak. Do you want to just go back to that one?
Um, yeah. It's just so you can kind of see this bill is just way longer than a regular Pinyon Jay bill. And sometimes you can see crossings. If you go to this website, you can see, I mean, some extreme cases of it with chickadees just like really long and crossed. So yeah, I don't know a lot about that. I just something I observed. So yeah, I'm not an expert on this at all.
Yeah. Where would someone report findings of nestings, though?
If you ever thought you got into a nesting colony, you can send an email to me. We've actually done some trainings and things with citizen science, basically Colorado field ornithologists, to kind of talk about breeding behaviors, which, there's a lot of them, which I couldn't cover in this presentation, but you can get on their website. It has my contact information, or Annie, you can share my contact information email, and you're welcome to send me any kind of sightings that you have.
Great. Um, Getting into some of that habitat needs and the treatments to work on conservation. How do you balance masticating pinyon juniper trees for sage grouse versus allowing trees for pinyon jays?
Well, I think, this has been a new question for Pinyon Jays. And I think, like we talked about, Pinyon Jays like open areas and they like to forage where there's grasses and forbs and insects. And so I don't think it's an either or. I think that you can do some Pinyon Jay treatments. If it's near a colony, I would advocate for potentially hand treatment so that you're not creating a lot of turning of the soils, things like that, and just promote those sagebrush communities. And then, I'm not a woodland expert either. And so just my idea is that we just protect where the jays are breeding and not disturb those nesting areas, protect those nesting areas and that area, maybe a buffer around those areas. Just work on hand thinning, timing restrictions. Don't do any treatments when the Pinyon Jays are breeding, because now we know they breed early and go until about the end of May. So that's different than your regular passerine. Um, and then do what you think is the most appropriate treatment away from that. What mastication you need to help that woodland, the ecosystem health, or those other species. But it's just kind of that idea of holistic management. We can't just focus on one animal at one time, especially as we're learning more about this other species. And I think it's important that we continue to map, find these colonies, learn what we can so that we can help inform people who are doing that land management.
Yeah. Another question with land management. Do you know how Pinyon Jays are doing in the Jumbo Mountain area with the new travel management plan?
The jumbo management, is that the one in Montrose?
Jumbo, I believe, is the one by Paonia.
Oh, by Pinyon. I knew that one. I don't know. I haven't been back to that colony since we did that one in 2020, 2021. So I don't know. I haven't gone back to reassess any impacts. I know that Pinyon Jays seem to do well. I mean, they don't seem to quit nesting when there's a lot of activity. We have a lot of colonies like around Salida and biking areas where I mean, there's just bikers everywhere when I've gone to these colonies, and the jays are still nesting, doing their thing. People ignore them, they ignore the jays. I have another colony that's right near a gravel pit that's so noisy, drives me crazy, but they just keep nesting and come back there year after year after year. So I think it's always that thing where if they're used to what's, this constant disturbance or this constant noise, they learn to adapt to it. So there are instances where they're dealing with humans and continuing to nest in those areas.
Yeah.
But it's
Um,
definitely a research project to look at the true impacts, but
yeah.
that's what we've seen.
A true scientist's answer. Um, we have another question about whether you can attract Pinyon Jays to a backyard feeder.
Oh yeah. Pinyon jays love feeders. They're interesting though because they will come to your feeders. They like water. So if you can provide water for them as well, that will be an extra incentive. But they can kind of come to feeders and feed, and then maybe one year they don't, and you're wondering why. And I think it's because of their resource availability. So in poor mast years, things like that, feeders may become super important for them to supplement them and maybe reduce the mileage that they have to travel to find other food resources. They do eat things like juniper berries as well. So it's not like they're just eating pinyon nuts, but they do like bird feeders. I'll put the caveat out there. If you get a lot of birds, pinyon jays, or any other bird, make sure you're cleaning those feeders because we definitely have seen an increase in avian diseases such as salmonella, things like that.
Yeah. And hey, maybe put some Mormon crickets in the feeder and
Yeah.
you'll get some
Yeah, if you
jays.
can find those, if you want to go grab some. I just know
Um,
people in those areas are like, the Mormon crickets, but wildlife definitely likes to eat them.
yeah. Well, collect them and stash them in your freezer for when you're looking to
Yeah.
refill your feeder.
Yeah.
Another question going back to some of those behaviors. Do adults support juveniles? If so, in what way? I think you shared at the beginning that those juveniles are maybe acting as the sentries. Was that right?
So like the yearling birds that come, so what's funny is the yearling birds you'll see the adults and the adults are the other ones that make the nests together. And then when the male is feeding the female, it's just pretty much the pair. You can have some of those yearling birds come in and help feed the nestlings. What was really interesting for me is when I first started following these nests through time and I knew a nest was getting very close to fledging, I was going in to check that nest. And as soon as I got like 50 yards from the nest, I just got mobbed by all these yearling birds. And I've seen this over and over when those nestlings get really ready to fledge, those yearlings really come into play and they guard them. And then when those fledglings are moving outside of the colony, the yearlings follow and help them and help them get out. And so the juveniles at that time, once the birds have fledged and start moving around, the yearlings are helping them. They're forming all these different kind of cohorts with the young of the year forming what we call a creche. And the parents will usually feed them for a month or so, but you get all these different breaking up of the flock, and those young fledgling juveniles will form into what we call a creche and kind of work together, but the adult birds will help them and the yearling birds.
Great, thank you. If anybody has any more questions to ask, we do have a few more minutes. Talking about how you got mobbed by those juveniles as you went in to try and check the nests. Earlier, I was wondering, you showed all those pictures of nests up close. And I'm sure when they're up to 6 feet off the ground, those might be easy enough to get to. Are you and your volunteers and technicians out climbing trees, or do you have other ways to observe those nests?
So yeah, I'm only 5'7", so looking into a 6-foot nest is not doable for me. So one, I use a really well, I'll just say this, use a really well trained technician group that we go through intensive training. We know when to back away from nests because I do worry about drawing attention into the colony, especially if ravens are the predators. But the way that we look into nests is we just have these little mirrors that are on a telescoping pole so we can just kind of look in. And so that's how we look in. The ones that we have some good shots off or was a parent off the nest and, with cell phones, you can just kind of pop a shot on them. So yeah, but most of the time we would just do a little telescoping mirror to see if there was a nestling or egg, and then we get out of there really quick.
Yeah, that's clever. Are raven populations growing?
Raven populations are thought to be increasing, and they are causing problems potentially for a number of bird species. We hear about them with sage grouse, being nest predators with sage grouse, and chicks, and then also desert tortoises. Um, there is some recent information with some of our point count data that they're not increasing, but overall it's thought that raven predation is increasing. And unfortunately, just so many of the areas where Pinyon Jays colonies are where we like to be, and then ravens like to be around us. And, it's just thinking about ways we can help manage to not get more ravens, from road kills to dumping to garbage dumps. That's everything that draws them in. And if they're in the area, they'll definitely come into Pinyon Jay colonies.
Yeah, I'm sure between the ravens and the jays, you're dealing with some smart research subjects.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's hard because I've loved ravens my whole life. And then when I'm following these colonies, I'm just like, oh, you ravens, leave them alone.
But would there be any plans to manage raven populations? That's a question we just got.
Um, there is no plans for Pinyon Jays right now to manage. It's a difficult task. A lot of times when I see the raven predation, it's like a pair that's nesting near the colony or something. So you would have to somehow figure out how to manage that pair. I mean, we'll have a lot of ravens flying over that I think don't even impact the colony, but it's kind of the pair that are hatching their own young and feeding and following the colony. And so it's a hard task right now for Pinyon Jays. I know for other species, they're talking about some raven management and what can be done. But for Pinyon Jays at this point in time, that hasn't been discussed.
Yeah, I'm sure that would open a whole can of worms.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, it looks like Terry, who's one of our superstar volunteers, she mentions that Jessiak Resnick at Colorado National Monument is worried about a decline there. I don't know if that's someone you're working with.
I haven't worked with that person, but if she wants to give me her contact, I can reach out. I mean, this is one thing we're hoping if we continue to do this work and now we've developed a pretty good protocol, we can kind of see if we're losing colonies or if those number of birds in the colonies are declining and just kind of see how they're doing, get a better handle on it. So it'd be
Yeah,
good to know other people that maybe are seeing something.
yeah. Well, it is 6:30 now, so I think that's a great resource to share tomorrow when I send out that email to everyone who's registered, just with this recording and some of these resources we've talked about. Amy, thank you so much for your time and for sharing all that with us. Um, if anyone here is not registered yet, we do have 2 more lectures coming up. Next week will be all about bumblebees, and the week after will be a presentation on 40 years in public lands management with former Gunnison Gorge NCA manager Ed Franz. Our presenter next week is also named Amy, and I believe she was on the call tonight listening in. So thank you, Amy, so much for your time, and I hope everyone enjoys their evening.
Thank you.